So one of the key components of any case presentation is the analysis that you conduct to support your recommendation. And generally, your analysis falls into two categories. The first one is your industry analysis, and your second is your financial analysis. And when it comes to conducting your industry analysis and financial analysis, what you want to present to the judges is the answer to this question. How does this analysis support my recommendation? So when it comes to the industry analysis, this is essentially using facts from the overall industry and the overall business world and looking to see how those facts support the strategy that you want to deploy. And so the source of this industry analysis generally comes from three categories. The first one are facts from the case itself. The second are white papers from consulting firms and research databases. And the third are case studies that other companies have used to justify their decisions. So if you want to open up a coffee shop in downtown Toronto, a good industry analysis will essentially look to understand what are consumer habits and what are consumer preferences as it comes to coffee. If coffee consumption is increasing, that could be an industry analysis and a fact that you use to justify your recommendation. When it comes to point three, you could also look to examine other coffee shops that have opened up in downtown Toronto and how they have succeeded. When it comes to a financial analysis, you're essentially looking to understand, will this make me money in the long run? And there are three ways in which you can do this. You can conduct revenue and costs over a specified period of time. You could then take this revenue and the cost and use metrics to justify how well and how profitable this venture will be. And the third are visuals. So essentially, when you're showing any sort of revenue or cost or any financial information, it's always best to use visuals to support your recommendation. So going back to the example of a coffee shop, if you have $25,000 to invest in a new business and it'll cost you $200,000 to open up a coffee shop, most likely the financials for this investment will not work out and you should not pursue this strategy. So moving on to the next slide, this is sort of how we showed our financial analysis in an actual case presentation. So our product was called Jarvis, and we essentially wanted to forecast our year-over-year sales. So we did this through 2018 and 2022, and the key takeaway from this slide is that it's very simple. Financial analysis can be convoluted and very hard to understand, but through the use of a chart, you can really easily showcase your point because you see on those bars, it's positively increasing. So that basically says, yeah, this is a good strategy to pursue. And so sometimes when you're doing financials, as I mentioned, it can be very convoluted. So generally, any calculations that you want to use can be tossed into the appendices. So we essentially did a cost to market breakdown and a payroll operating cost for our Jarvis product. And we used labor as essentially the main cost of each of these appendix. And we presented these in the appendices. And the judges actually asked us about these costs in our presentation, and we were able to allude to them in the question and answer section. So another form of analysis that you can use to basically show how strong your solution is by presenting an implementation strategy and a risk mitigation strategy. So an implementation strategy essentially answers one key question. How long will it take to implement the strategy or the recommendation that you're proposing? And essentially how you do this is determining the activities for implementation. So for example, when you buy a fan and you want to assemble a fan, you often get a manual. This manual has the steps of what it takes to actually build the fan. Think about your implementation strategy like this. You want to provide judges a detailed step-by-step breakdown and the time that it will take to implement each of the steps in your strategy and in your overall implementation. And the best way to show this is a Gantt chart, which I'll show you just on the next slide. So another way to support your recommendation and support your solution is by presenting the risks and alleviating them by presenting a mitigation strategy. So the way that you do this is by sitting down with your team and asking yourselves, what are the possible failure points in our strategy? And what are ways in which we can mitigate these strategies? So on this slide, here's an example of what our Gantt chart often looks like. And this is what you use to present your implementation strategy. Your activities are generally lined up on the left-hand side, and your units of time are generally lined up on the first row. And essentially for each activity, this is a really nice visual way of showing how long it will take to implement each activity.